Welcome to Chess News 19. Today I want to take a look at the game Jan Gustafsson's Peter Leko from the penultimate round in the Sparkassen chess tournament from Dortmund. This was the game that in the end decided who would win the tournament. So Gustafsson was leading and he had to play Peter Leko. So Leko won this game, and in the end it meant that he would be the tournament winner, because next day he drew his game quickly in the last round against Dortmund and could claim first prize. Okay, so let's have a look. Gustafsson was playing white, and Peter Leko usually plays the Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian, all depending on where white decides to develop his knight on the third move. So b6, Queen's Indian, g3, bishop a6, queen a4. These are all quite standard theoretical moves here. Bishop g2, c5. An exchange on c5, castles. Bishop e7, knight c3. Black also castles. And rook d1. Now with this move we can already see a little bit how the game will evolve, because white is putting pressure over the d file here, and this pawn here on d7 is still a bit backward. So now black removes his queen from the d file, and white plays bishop f4, also nicely looking at these squares here and intensifying the pressure. Now black plays rook d8 in this position. Note that queen takes b2 would be a terrible mistake because of rook b1, and black can now capture the knight, but white will recapture the piece on b7 and is now threatening the queen with bishop e5, which has no real escape. So in this position black would be losing. So instead of queen takes b2 after bishop f4, rook d8 is a much better and solid move. Now rook d2, this prepares the double on the d file, but also simultaneously protects the b pawn. d6 is now played. This has the knight effect that now the bishop is protecting the pawn. So rook a d1 followed, and knight ea is played. Once more protecting the pawn here in a very solid way. Okay, now a number of moves have been played here on the 14th move for white. One idea, a very funny idea, would be to play, for instance, knight e5 to try and make use of the pin of the d file here, of the d pawn here over the d file. For instance, black could make a mistake then with d takes e5 because of rook takes d8, bishop takes d8. And now that the defender of the knight on e8 has been exchanged, queen e8 is mate all of a sudden. So after knight e5, it would be better for black to exchange bishops on g2, like this. And then after queen b7, e4, white would enjoy some kind of opening advantage here. Okay, but knight e8 was not followed with knight e5, but with a relatively new move, e4. Okay, now Leko chased away white's queen, bishop c6, and white's queen went back to c2. And now Leko intensifies the pressure on the central pawn on e4 with queen b7. And this explains why Gustafsson plays queen b3 here. The idea of white here is to play e4, e5 in this line. But in this case it would not be possible, because then the knight on f3 would be lost. So in order to decrease the pressure over the long diagonal, white plays here queen b3, offering an exchange of queens. Now black could make the mistake of playing bishop takes e4, because then white would lure the queen into the center with knight takes e4, and after queen takes e4, knight h4, the black queen is trapped all of a sudden. So this would be an obviously losing position for black. So in the game, after queen b3, Leko played queen takes b3, and a takes b3 was followed, of course. And now again, white has the idea of playing e4, e5, intensifying the pressure here on the pawn on d6, and also trying to make use of the pin of the d file. Now Leko defended here with pawn to f6. But the funny thing is that this is not really preventing e5. And I think that e5 would probably have been Gustafsson's best move here. Let's have a look. e5 for instance. F takes e5 could follow. But white can now safely play knight takes e5 because there is still a pin on the d file. And after an exchange on g2, and for instance rook c8, bringing the rook out of the d file, and a knight retreat to f3, white would still maintain a certain opening advantage. He still has the pressure here against the pawn on d6. Maybe he can intensify the pressure with moves like knight b5, or also go for this somewhat weak e6 pawn with moves like knight g5 for instance. I'm not sure if this is a winning advantage, but it would just be a nice small but long-lasting advantage to my opinion. However, he didn't play that after f6. Another option, by the way, would have been to play knight b5, also interesting. We will not go into that right now. But Gustafsson played here knight e1. And although there are some ideas attached to this move, I don't like this move, because to my opinion, white now starts to switch his attention too much. Okay, so one of the ideas of knight e1 would be to bring the knight to d3, then attack the pawn on c5, which would threaten to take the pawn on c5, still because of the pin over the d file. And another idea would be also the overprotection of square b4, so that white could resolve his double pawn in playing b3, b4. But of course it is now black's move, and black plays knight d7. So this develops a piece, overprotects c5, and black is fine now. Okay, still it would have been possible here for white to play e5. And I still think that that would have been his best option. Now, these lines are all very tactical. Let's have a look at what could follow. If bishop takes g2, that would be a mistake, because white would now play the in-between e takes d6, and now both bishops would be en prise. So after, for instance, bishop f8 and king takes g2, white would be a pawn up. Also, after e5, black could make a mistake in playing f takes e5, because then white would play bishop takes c6, winning the knight. Of course, black can recapture now a piece on f8, but now white wins the exchange on a8. Okay, so the best move in this case would be after e5 to play knight takes e5. And then the line would run as follows. Bishop takes e5, which eliminates the defender of the bishop on c6. So in between bishop takes g2 is forced. But now not king takes g2, but first bishop takes d6, winning the pawn here on d6, and after knight takes d6, we're capturing the piece on g2. And white still maintains a very slight plus here. But probably the most important thing is that in this position, knight f5 is not such a strong move as it will be a few moves later on in the game. Let's have a look. If in this position black would play knight f5, then there could follow rook takes d8 check. And now there are two lines, of course. Let's have a look at rook takes d8 first. There would follow rook takes d8, luring the bishop to d8, so away from the protection of the pawn on c5. And now can white can attack this pawn on c5 with tempo, knight d3. And after bishop b6, for instance, knight a4, 2 times attacking the pawn on c5, white has a significant advantage. Okay, if after rook takes c8 check, black would recapture with the bishop, then for similar reasons knight e4 would be strong, attacking the pawn. And after bishop e7, protecting the pawn, then white has the invading rook d7, and he also has a significant advantage in this position. So that's why I believe that after knight d7, e4, e5 would still be a very good and reasonable try for white here. And it would make sense, because he has put his pawn on e4, so why not, with still both rooks on the d file, why not play e4, e5? Okay, well, you may understand that white did not play like that. Now, Gustafsson started to switch his attention once more with the somewhat dubious, to my opinion, rook a1. Now we understand that maybe Gustafsson wants to put his rook on a3 to protect the weak pawn on b3 and also simultaneously attack the pawn on a7. But now black has some time to do a little bit of regrouping himself, and there's less pressure now on d6, and black can also start to become active. So his first move is of course rook d b8, taking control of the b file and hitting the weak pawn on b3, of course. So this weakness is now really starting to tell. Rook a3 followed, logical, protecting the pawn, and rook b7 followed, which prepares also to bring this rook into play, for instance to b8. And now it is a little bit too late for white. He plays e4, e5 after all. But it seems that he is slowly but surely drifting into an inferior position from now on. So black takes the pawn now. Bishop takes e5, eliminating the defender of the bishop on c6. So bishop g2 in between is necessary. Bishop d6. Knight takes d6. And white now recaptures the piece on g2. But now, and this is the difference with the position we saw earlier, knight f5 is very strong and secures a black advantage. Note that white no longer has the option of exchanging rooks on d8, thereby displacing black's pieces so that his knights could take the initiative in attacking the weak pawn on c5. No. Rather, it is black now who has the initiative. He threatens to bring his knight now to the very strong central square on d4. And this guy here is also already very nicely placed on the b file. So let's see what happened in the game after knight f5. Gustafsson here played rook a6. And of course he would very much like to exchange his weak pawn on b3 for the pawn on e6, when all of a sudden he would be in the driving seat again. But Leko wants nothing of it. Of course, after rook a6, he plays knight d4. Now the knight is very strongly posted here in the center. It protects the pawn here on e6 and also attacks the weak pawn here on b3. Note that it also cannot be chased away, because there are no more white pawns here on the E and C files. Okay, after knight d4, it was Gustafsson's turn again to come up with something. He played here knight f3, but this move does not really accomplish a lot, because the knight sitting on f3 cannot really jump into g5 or into e5, and of course he threatens now to take the knight on d5, on d4, which would win a pawn. But Leko, of course, now snaps off the pawn like this, knight b3. So now he is a pawn up, and the advantage for black is growing. So after knight d4 instead of knight f3, I think that maybe knight d3 would have been a better try. At least this does not put the knight on f3, where it is not so active, and it attacks the weak pawn here on c5. So maybe in combination with moves like knight e4 or knight a4 or possibly rook c6, when the knight may have moved away from d4, this could have been a more tenacious defense for white. Okay, back to the game, where after knight f3, as mentioned, Leko, of course, played knight takes b3. And now white's rook is attacked, so Gustafsson moved it to d3. And again a very easy move here for black, e6, e5. Bolstering up the stronghold on d4, so now preparing to bring back the knight to that central square if necessary. And also it moves away from the attack by white's rook here. Now the position is difficult to play for white. He has no real ideas. So now he plays rook d5. At least this puts a little bit of pressure on the c5 pawn. But Leko now brings his last piece into play also, rook d8. And white exchanges. Now slowly but surely he is drifting into a losing position here. But the nasty thing is that a counterattack, such as knight e4, to try and win the pawn on c5 at some stage, also doesn't work. For instance, because of rook b d7, threatening to win a pawn on d5. However, then white could recapture here on a7. And now rook a3, for instance. Come on, my computer is hanging. Yeah, rook a3, which would attack the defender of the pawn on c5. But the thing is that after knight d4, knight c5 isn't working, and it is a blunder actually, because now black eliminates the defender of the knight on c5 by exchanging one pair of rooks on d5, and of course now bishop takes c5 wins a piece. So a difficult position for Gustafsson to play, and after rook d8 he didn't play knight e4, but he exchanged rooks here. Now at least this has the small advantage that the bishop is temporarily on a less active square. Gustafsson could have played here knight e4, but after bishop b6, safely securing both of black's weak pawns, black would also be cruising to victory. I think at some point he could bring back the knight here to d4, or first try and come in with the rook here to d3 or to d1 or something like that. And this rook here would really be lonely out there, you know, just fighting the bishop and the pawns. Okay, so after bishop d6, Gustafsson played rook d6. At least this takes over the d7 square, so that black's rook cannot go there. But after bishop e7 he saw nothing better than to return to a6. And now it is time for black to re-centralize his knight, so knight d4 followed, and white only has unhappy choices now. In the game he exchanged on d4, which would really connect black's pawns. So you could say, doesn't look like the best option, but a move like knight e2 is also not very nice, because of rook takes b2, rook takes a7, and now rook takes d2, rook takes e7, and rook c2, for instance, also winning for black. So in this stage we cannot really criticize Gustafsson's moves anymore. So knight takes d4 was played here. And now Leko can still make a serious strategical error here, because how to recapture the knight now? With the c pawn or with the e pawn? Now let's have a look at the move that he didn't play, which would be a grave mistake. E takes d4. Now why would that be a mistake? Because after knight b5 the pawn on a7 is in danger. Black can no longer protect it. Note that the c5 square is not accessible in this case for black's bishop. And also we would have a classical situation of a bad bishop against a strong knight, and white's king could also quite easily come into the center and start blockading or even attacking these black pawns. So after a line such as king f7, king f3, f5, protecting the e4 square, and king e2, king e8, and now an exchange or a regain of the pawn, I should say, on a7, king d7, king d3, the most probable outcome is a draw all of a sudden. So that explains why e takes d4 would be a grave mistake. But of course Leko understands these things. He is a super grandmaster and he recaptures with c takes d4. Now this has the huge advantage that it keeps the bishop on e7 active all the way along the diagonal towards a3. Note also that it has access to c5 from where it would protect the a7 pawn, and recapturing like this also creates a beautiful phalanx in the center. Now look at these f, e and d pawns. They will move forward and are virtually unstoppable now. So black now has a winning advantage, and white tries to make the best of it. He blocks the b file now and protects his b pawn, simultaneously attacking the a7 pawn. But now here the pawns come. d3, which is simply threatening to play d2 and to promote. Okay, now bishop c5 would also be strong, but d3 is very good. Now Gustafsson can play king f1 just in time to stop the pawn, because now after d2, of course, king e2 could follow. And if Gustafsson would try something similar to the line we just saw, where black would recapture on d4 with the e pawn, we get a line like this, king f3. But note that in this case it is very difficult for white's king to come closer to the pawn, and after rook d7 and rook takes a7, we can now see a vital other difference between the recaptures on d4, because now black does not have a pawn on the c file but on the e file, and he now can play e4 check, which is really dislodging white's king here. And after king e4, black can now win by exchanging rooks, because white cannot really recapture the rook, because d2 would then queen. Okay, so that about the differences in recapturing on d4. Back to the game, where after d3 Gustafsson played king f1 just in time, and now Leko simply improves his piece. Bishop c5, attacking the a7 pawn, but also attacking the f2 pawn. Now rook c6 follows, and probably in time trouble, Leko now slips up and endangers the win. He allows the white king to access the pawn a little bit too early, because he plays here d2. Much stronger would have been bishop b4, which would still keep white's king out of the center, and after rook a6, king f7, and a move like f3, f5, it would become clear that in the long run black will win this, because there is simply no stopping the pawn majority in the center. Okay, so back to d2, where Leko is making things much more difficult for him than necessary. Now Gustafsson is up to the task for a few moves. He now plays, of course, king e2, and all of a sudden the pawn on d2 and the bishop on c5 are both attacked. Now that is not really a problem yet, because Leko has rook d7. So if now rook takes c5, then of course d2, d1 queens will win simply for black. So white has to defend once more, and he plays knight c3, overprotecting the queening square on d1. And black could now make a mistake with bishop b4, when after knight d5, the win has become very questionable again. But after knight c3 he didn't play that, he played bishop d4, and it would seem that now Gustafsson also makes a mistake in time trouble. Probably the toughest move would have been to play knight d1, protecting both the f and b pawns and preparing to move the b pawn forward. And note that this pawn here is now solidly blockaded and not an immediate threat to white's position. But instead of knight d1 after bishop d4, Gustafsson played here king d2. And it is very logical that he eliminates now this terrible threat, you know, this free pawn. But after bishop takes f2 check, it becomes apparent that black is still winning. Now white can put his knight in the center, which is very nice, of course. But here comes the a pawn, and still black has a very serious majority on the king side also. Now white could have played a move like rook a6, you know, just putting his rook behind the free pawn. But then black simply has rook a7, and an endgame such as rook a7, bishop a7, I suppose would be won for black in the long run. Just look at the difference in pieces, you know. White has a knight, but black has a bishop. And since there are pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop is usually stronger than the knight. Also, the b and c pawns are blockaded here. They cannot really come forward. And also a very important factor is that black can quite easily activate his king, come to the center, and then start pushing his his kingside majority pawns. So after a5, white tried something else. He played b3 here. But then there followed king f7, slowly but surely strengthening the position. g4, trying to set up a little bit of a blockade on the white squares. But now Leko played rook b7, again attacking this weakness on the b file. And I suppose that king c2 would now have been the most toughest move, but instead of that Gustafsson now played king e2 and is really removing now his king from the weak b pawn. Leko plays bishop d4, nicely centralated bishop here, and after h4 he played e4. And now, you know, also this king is having a bit of a trouble, you know, he no longer has access to these squares, for instance, here. So there followed h5, but now the win is within Leko's grasp. He takes the pawn now, and he is not afraid of this check on c7, because after king e6, Gustafsson resigned. Now why did he resign? For instance, rook g7 would not be dangerous, because now the a pawn has become a free pawn, and it can safely go to a3, and the queening square is also protected. So in a certain case you only need black to give a check here, for instance on the second rank, like this, and then also this square would be protected. But probably more importantly, after a move like rook e7 check, king d6, rook e4, white is desperately trying to get to this a pawn. Bishop e5, now a small trick, knight takes f6, bishop take f6, c5, discovered check, king c5, rook a4, h6, black is winning. So that decided matters in the Dortmund Sparkassen chess meeting. Probably Leko's most important win, along with the one from the second round, where he beat Vasily Ivanchuk in very nice fashion. So probably a very deserved winner of this year's tournament. And that ends our discussion of this interesting game. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please, until next time, bye bye.